Before the storm ever arrived, the forest already knew winter. Not the violent kind, not the screaming wind or snapping cold, but the slow, patient winter that settles in gently, like a long-held breath. Snow lay thin and undisturbed across the forest floor. It softened the shapes of roots and stones, filled the spaces between fallen branches, and turned every sound into something distant and muted. The trees stood tall and still, their bare limbs reaching into a pale sky that looked washed clean of color. Nothing moved quickly here. The forest had lived through many winters before. It had bent under snow, endured cold nights, listened to wind pass through its trunks like a low song. Each tree carried its own memory, rings hidden deep inside, marking years of drought, years of abundance, years of quiet survival. That morning the air felt heavier than usual. Birds stayed silent. Even the smallest sounds, footsteps of deer, the soft fall of snow slipping from a branch, seemed to hesitate before happening. The clouds above were thick and low, pressing down on the world as if they were considering something. Then, slowly, almost politely, the first freezing rain began to fall. At first it barely noticed itself. A thin glaze formed on twigs and needles. Drops clung to bark and hardened, turning rough surfaces smooth and glassy. The forest accepted it without resistance. Ice had come before. Ice always came and went. But this ice did not stop. Hour by hour, layer by layer, the weight grew. Branches bowed slightly, then a little more. The sound of the forest changed, not louder, but tighter. Every creak carried farther. Every small movement felt strained. The storm was patient. By nightfall, the trees were no longer simply standing. They were holding the cold, holding the silence, holding a burden that had not yet shown its true intention. Deep within the forest, where sunlight rarely reached even in summer, a narrow line of ancient trees stood shoulder to shoulder. They had grown together for centuries, roots tangled beneath the frozen ground, forming a natural divide between two halves of the woodland. They did not know it yet, but by morning that line would become something else entirely. The ice continued to fall, and the forest waited. The night stretched long and unbroken, as if time itself had slowed to watch. Freezing rain fell steadily, not loud enough to be called a storm, not gentle enough to be ignored. Each drop struck wood, leaf, and stone, then hardened in place, turning motion into stillness. Branches grew thicker by the hour, no longer shaped like branches at all, but like clear, frozen veins reaching outward into the dark. The trees listened. They listened to the weight settling into their limbs. They listened to the faint ticking sound of ice tightening as temperatures fell. They listened to one another, each trunk answering another with a quiet creak, a low groan that traveled through bark and root. In the deepest part of the forest, the oldest trees stood unmoving. Their trunks were wide and scarred, their bark furrowed by time. They had endured storms that snapped younger trees like twigs. They had survived fires, droughts, and winters that buried the forest in snow, taller than a man. But this was different. Snow rests, ice clings. By midnight, branches that once swayed easily now bent stiffly, their flexibility stolen by glassy armor. Small limbs began to fail first. One snapped somewhere in the distance, sharp, sudden, final. The sound echoed far, then vanished, swallowed by the frozen air. Animals stayed hidden. Deer pressed close to the ground. Foxes curled tight beneath fallen logs. Even the owls refused to call, as if the forest itself had agreed to remain quiet. The storm did not rage. It simply continued. As the hours passed, gravity became the loudest force in the forest. Ice thickened until branches sagged under the strain, leaning against neighboring trees for support. Some found strength in this closeness. Others leaned too far, pulling each other down inch by inch. The narrow line of ancient trees, the ones standing shoulder to shoulder, began to feel the pressure first. Their crowns were dense, their branches interlocked high above the forest floor. Ice built up there faster, collecting in heavy layers where branches crossed and overlapped. The weight did not distribute evenly. It gathered quietly, choosing sides. A deep crack sounded from within one massive trunk. Not a break, a warning. The sound traveled downward through wood and root into the frozen ground. Nearby trees responded with low, strained groans, like voices waking from uneasy sleep. The forest was no longer merely holding the ice, it was arguing with it. Somewhere near dawn, the temperature dropped just enough to harden the ice completely. What had been flexible became rigid. What could have bent now resisted. The forest had reached a moment of balance, so delicate that even a breath could disturb it. And above the treetops, the clouds finally began to thin, revealing a sky pale with early morning light, beautiful, quiet, and completely unaware of what the forest was about to lose. Morning arrived without warmth. Light filtered through the ice-coated canopy and scattered into 1,000 reflections, turning the forest into something unreal. Every branch shone, every twig glimmered. The entire woodland looked preserved, as if time itself had frozen in place. For a brief moment, it was beautiful. Then the forest moved. It began with a sound so low it could almost be mistaken for wind, except there was no wind. The sound came from deep within the trunks, from places no light reached. Wood fibers stretched beyond their limits. Ice tightened its grip. A single branch broke free. It did not fall quickly. It hesitated, caught in the web of frozen limbs around it, then pulled loose with a sharp crack that sliced through the silence. The branch struck another on the way down, setting off a chain of small collisions before disappearing into the snow below. The forest flinched. That first break changed something. The balance that had held through the night shifted, just enough to invite gravity back into the conversation. Ice that had been stable a moment before began to slide. Branches pressed harder against one another. The sound of strain multiplied. Then came the tree. It stood near the ancient line. Tall, straight, its trunk scarred by decades of storms. It had survived longer than most. But its crown bore the heaviest burden of ice, layered thick where branches crossed and trapped freezing rain. The trunk groaned. The sound was deep and hollow, rolling outward like distant thunder. Nearby trees answered with creaks of their own, as if warning it or mourning it already. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the trunk began to lean. Roots tore free from the frozen ground with a sound like cloth ripping apart. Ice shattered along the branches as they shifted, raining sharp fragments that chimed as they struck other trees. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then the tree fell. It did not crash all at once. It descended in stages, catching on neighboring trunks, dragging them down inch by inch. Branches snapped. Smaller trees bent violently, some springing back, others breaking under the sudden strain. When the trunk finally struck the ground, the impact traveled outward in a wave. Snow leapt into the air, ice shattered into countless pieces. The sound rolled through the forest, long and echoing, like a bell rung far too hard. Silence followed. Not peaceful silence, shocked silence. The fallen tree lay across the forest floor, its crown shattered, its trunk cracked where it had twisted during the fall. Around it, damage spread outward like ripples in water. Several younger trees leaned awkwardly now, their roots partially torn free, their futures uncertain. The ancient line had been breached, and the ice, sensing weakness, continued to press down without mercy. Somewhere deeper in the forest, another trunk began to groan. The silence after the fall did not last long. It fractured, slowly at first, into scattered sounds that had never belonged together before. Ice slid from broken branches and shattered on the ground like brittle glass. Snow dropped from shaken limbs in soft, uneven waves. Somewhere far off, another tree creaked, then fell quiet again, as if reconsidering. The forest was no longer whole. Where the first tree had fallen, light poured into a space that had not seen open sky in generations. The snow there sparkled differently, exposed and raw. Cold air moved more freely through the gap, slipping between trunks, touching bark that had been protected until now. The ice did not melt. It adjusted. Branches that had leaned gently against one another during the night were now pressed together at sharper angles. The weight shifted unpredictably. Some trees found relief as pressure eased. Others inherited burdens that were never meant to be theirs. Then came a sound the forest had never made before. It was not a snap, not a crack, not even a fall. It was a long, tearing noise, drawn out and trembling, as if something enormous were being slowly pulled apart. The sound traveled low through the ground, through roots locked together beneath the ice, through soil hardened like stone. Along the ancient line of trees, the earth itself began to give way. Roots that had grown intertwined over centuries strained against one another. Some held. Others tore free, snapping thick fibers that had never known separation. The trees responded instinctively, leaning, twisting, pressing into their neighbors for support. That support failed. One tree began to fall, dragging two others with it. As they leaned, their crowns caught in surrounding branches, transferring their weight outward like a spreading fracture. Ice shattered violently now, falling in sharp bursts that rang through the forest like broken chimes. The sound grew louder, deeper, unmistakable. Tree after tree began to fail, not all at once, but in a slow, devastating sequence. Each fall weakened the next. Each break widened the gap forming through the heart of the forest. What had once been a narrow line was becoming a divide. Snow exploded upward with every impact. Trunks struck the ground with dull, bone-deep thuds. Smaller trees vanished beneath collapsing giants. The air filled with drifting ice dust, catching the pale morning light and turning it into a glittering haze. Animals fled where they could. Deer burst from cover and ran blindly through falling debris. Birds scattered in frantic silence, wings flashing briefly before disappearing into the gray sky. The forest was breaking, not in chaos, but in order, following the invisible logic of weight, age, and strain. By the time the noise began to fade, a scar had opened across the woodland floor. A long, uneven corridor of destruction stretched as far as the eye could see, trees fallen inward from both sides, roots torn free, branches tangled in frozen ruin. The ice storm had not simply damaged the forest. It had split it in half. And still the cold remained. When the noise finally faded, it left behind something heavier than silence. The forest stood stunned, as if unsure how to exist in its new shape. Where trunks once rose in dense, unbroken ranks, there was now open space, wide, jagged, and wrong. Snow drifted into the gap almost immediately, trying to soften the damage, trying to pretend nothing had changed. But the scar was too large. Trees on either side of the divide leaned inward, their broken branches reaching across the emptiness, as if searching for what had been torn away. Some still held, roots straining beneath the frozen soil. Others stood at impossible angles, alive but wounded, waiting for a future that felt uncertain. Sunlight poured into the opening for the first time in centuries. It revealed details the forest had never needed to see before: splintered wood, pale as bone, exposed roots glazed in ice, the dark soil beneath torn open and raw. The ground was uneven now, littered with fallen giants that lay crisscrossed like the remains of a forgotten battle. Cold air flowed freely through the corridor, sharper than anywhere else in the forest. It carried the faint scent of sap and broken wood, a smell usually hidden beneath leaves and earth. The ice held everything still, preserving the damage exactly as it had happened. Nothing moved. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. In the hours that followed, the temperature rose only slightly, just enough to make the ice complain. Small pops and clicks echoed from branches as the frozen layers adjusted, tightening and loosening in slow cycles. Each sound made the standing trees shudder, as if bracing for another collapse. But no more fell. For now, as daylight strengthened, animals cautiously returned to the edges of the divide. Tracks appeared in the snow, hesitant, circling, never crossing fully. The open space felt exposed, dangerous, unfamiliar. What had once been safe cover was now a wide wound open to the sky. Deep within the fallen trunks, life still pulsed. Sap moved sluggishly. Insects slept, unaware that their world had shifted. Seeds lay buried beneath the snow, waiting patiently, knowing nothing of halves or scars. The forest had survived the storm, but survival was not the same as healing. The divide would change everything: how light moved, how wind traveled, how future storms would strike. It would decide which trees lived and which slowly failed. It would shape the forest for generations that had not yet grown. And as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, shadows stretched across the scar, long and uneven, marking the place where the forest would always remember the night it was split apart. Night returned gently, as if careful not to disturb what remained. The sky dimmed from pale gray to deep blue, and the first stars appeared above the torn canopy. Cold settled again into the open scar, sinking deeper there than anywhere else. Without the shelter of overlapping branches, the divide cooled faster, harder, until the air itself felt brittle. The forest did not sleep. Trees remember in ways that are not written or spoken. They remember through tension, held in fibers, through scars sealed slowly over years, through roots that never quite relax again. Along the split, trunks stood rigid, carrying the memory of strain deep inside their wood. Every creak now felt dangerous. A light wind finally dared to pass through the gap. It moved cautiously at first, brushing against broken branches, slipping over fallen trunks. The sound it made was different, sharper, more hollow. Where the forest had once softened every movement, the open corridor allowed sound to travel freely. The divide had found its voice. Some trees responded by leaning away, their growth subtly changing direction, even in this frozen state. Others leaned inward, as if hoping closeness might restore what had been lost. Roots beneath the snow shifted slowly, settling into new positions, searching for stability in altered ground. Far beneath the surface, the soil itself adjusted. Water trapped below the ice expanded and contracted with the cold, widening cracks made during the storm. Tiny movements, invisible above ground, continued the work the ice had begun. The forest was still changing, even in stillness. Moonlight spilled into the scar and painted the fallen trunks in pale silver. Shadows stretched long and uneven, crossing one another like tangled memories. The divide looked less like destruction now, and more like a boundary, something that separated one side from another, marking before and after. On one side, the forest stood denser, darker, unchanged in its familiar ways. On the other, light reached farther, touching trunks that had never known it, waking possibilities that had waited centuries for a chance. The ice remained, holding everything in suspension, but deep within the forest, beneath snow and silence, time continued its slow work. Healing had not begun yet. That would come later, through thaw, through rot, through growth and decay. For now, the forest simply remembered, and it waited. The thaw did not arrive suddenly. It came the way all real changes do, quietly, almost politely, slipping in during the warmest hours of the day and retreating again at night. At first, nothing seemed different. The ice still coated every branch. The snow still held its shape. The forest remained locked in the posture the storm had forced upon it, but beneath the surface, things were loosening. Tiny streams of meltwater began to form where ice met bark. They ran slowly, following the grooves of trunks, collecting at the bases of trees before disappearing into the frozen ground. Each drop carried away a little tension, a little weight. The forest listened again. With the thaw came sound. Ice cracked more often now, not sharply, but with dull, tired pops. Sheets of it slid from branches and shattered on the ground, leaving wood exposed for the first time since the storm. Sunlight struck these wet surfaces and darkened them, revealing scars, twists, and breaks that had been hidden under glass. Along the divide, the damage became clearer. Trees that had seemed merely bent were now visibly broken, their trunks split partway through, fibers torn and frayed. Some still stood, but only because neighboring trees held them up. Others leaned at angles that no longer looked temporary. Their roots, exposed and muddied, told the truth the ice had concealed. The fallen trunks began to settle. As the ground softened, they sank unevenly into the snow and soil, shifting with low, grinding sounds. Branches that had been suspended in midair finally dropped, stirring up old leaves buried beneath the snow. The scent of earth, dark and cold, rose into the air, life noticed. Small animals returned more boldly now, venturing onto fallen logs, testing the openness of the scar. Birds perched on broken branches that once would have been far above the forest floor. Insects stirred beneath bark that had cracked under pressure. The divide was no longer just a wound. It was becoming a place. Light lingered there longer each day, warming the soil just enough to change it. Water pooled in shallow depressions where roots had torn free. Seeds carried by wind and animal found places to rest where none had existed before. The forest had not chosen this change, but it was already adapting to it. As the thaw continued, the last of the ice released its hold. Branches lifted slightly as their weight vanished. Some trees straightened a little, relieved. Others sagged, finally revealing how much strength they had lost. And through it all, the scar remained, clear, open, irreversible. The storm was gone. Its work was not. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept. Warmth gathered in pockets, along sunlit bark, beside dark stones, within the open scar where light now reached the ground without permission. Snow retreated unevenly, leaving behind damp earth and flattened leaves that smelled faintly of age and renewal. Along the divide, the change was unmistakable. On one side, the forest remained as it had always been, dim, enclosed, patient. Shadows lingered there even at midday. The air stayed cooler, heavier, slow to move. Moss held to trunks in familiar patterns. Growth followed old rules. On the other side, the scar altered everything. Sunlight poured in for hours at a time, warming soil that had never felt direct light before. Meltwater pooled and lingered. Seeds that had waited quietly for decades now sensed their moment. Tiny green shoots appeared, fragile, uncertain, but persistent. The fallen trees became bridges and shelters. Their bark softened. Fungi crept outward in pale fans and dark clusters, breaking down what had once stood tall. Insects found new homes in splintered wood. Birds nested lower, closer to the ground, adapting to a changed ceiling of sky. The divide was no longer silent. Wind moved differently now, slipping easily through the open corridor, carrying sounds farther than before. A call from one side echoed faintly to the other, crossing the space that had once been solid forest. The two halves listened to each other in unfamiliar ways. Roots continued to adjust. Some trees sent new growth toward the light, leaning subtly, year by year. Others, damaged too deeply, weakened slowly, their leaves thinning, their crowns shrinking. Loss came quietly, without ceremony, one tree at a time. But growth came too. Grasses took hold. Young saplings rose where giants had fallen. Their trunks were thin, flexible, shaped by wind rather than resistance. They bent easily, learning lessons the old forest had never needed. The storm had not just split the forest in half. It had begun to turn one forest into two. Different light, different wind, different futures. And as seasons passed, the scar did not close, it defined. Time does not pass evenly through a forest. In the shaded half, years continued to move slowly. Growth came in careful increments. Leaves unfolded later in spring and fell earlier in autumn. Moisture lingered. The ground stayed cool, and decay worked patiently, returning fallen matter back to soil in quiet cycles. Nothing hurried there. Across the divide, time behaved differently. Sunlight accelerated everything. Saplings stretched upward quickly, competing for space that had suddenly become abundant. Grasses spread, then retreated as shrubs took hold. Flowers bloomed earlier, brighter, then vanished again. The soil warmed faster and dried sooner, forcing roots to grow deeper, faster. The same seasons passed on both sides, but they were felt differently. Storms, when they came, struck the divide first. Wind gathered speed as it crossed the open space, bending young trees and rattling branches. Rain fell harder there, unbroken by canopy. Snow piled unevenly, drifting into shapes the old forest had never known. Each year, the scar grew more familiar. Paths formed where animals crossed repeatedly, learning where fallen trunks offered shelter or passage. Birds learned new routes through the open air. Predators learned to wait along the edges, where cover met exposure. The fallen giants continued to sink and soften, becoming part of the ground itself. Their rings, records of centuries, blurred and faded as fungi and insects erased the lines of time, and still the two halves watched each other. From the dense forest, the scar looked bright and restless, always changing, always shifting. From the open side, the old forest looked dark and unmoving, a wall of patience and memory. Neither side returned to what it had been. They did not need to. The storm had taught the forest something permanent, that survival did not mean sameness, and endurance did not guarantee continuity. What lasted was not the shape of the forest, but its ability to continue, altered but alive. Years passed. Children of trees that had fallen during the ice storm grew tall enough to cast their own shadows. The divide softened at its edges, but it never vanished. It remained, a quiet line where the forest remembered the night ice learned how to break wood. Long after the ice storm faded from memory beyond the forest, its mark remained where nothing else could reach it. There came a time when no living tree along the divide had stood through the storm itself. The giants that had cracked and fallen were gone, their wood returned to soil, their names unspoken. In their place stood new growth, taller now, stronger, shaped by open sky and restless wind. Yet the line endured. It could still be traced by those who knew how to look. The ground changed texture there. The soil felt looser, richer in some places, thinner in others. The trees along the boundary leaned in subtle agreement, their growth patterns bending toward or away from the light that had once rushed in uninvited. The forest had grown older, not in years, but in understanding. Every strong wind that crossed the divide was remembered differently on each side. One half absorbed it slowly, layers of canopy breaking its force. The other accepted it directly, flexing and yielding without resistance. Neither way was better. Both were survival. Seasons continued their quiet rotation. Snow still fell, rain still came, summers still warmed the leaves, and winters still tested the wood. But no storm ever shaped the forest in quite the same way again. The trees had learned balance through loss, strength through change. The divide no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a chapter, a place where the forest had paused, adapted, and continued. A reminder that even the strongest systems can be altered by patience rather than force, by weight rather than violence. If one stood at the edge of the scar and listened carefully, especially in winter, there was still a sound, soft, deep, almost imagined. Not the tearing of wood or the shattering of ice, but the low, steady presence of trees standing together and apart at once. The forest had been split, but it had not been ended. And in that quiet endurance, it found a new kind of wholeness. Another winter came, not fierce, not famous, but honest. Snow arrived early and stayed late. It filled the divide gently, rounding its sharpest edges, softening the memory of fallen trunks that now lay buried and nearly forgotten. From a distance, the forest looked whole again, at least in outline. But up close, the differences were clear. In the shaded half, snow rested lightly on layered branches, caught and held above the ground. It fell quietly, evenly, and stayed cold for weeks at a time. The air there felt thick, insulated, slow to change. Across the divide, snow behaved differently. With fewer branches to catch it, flakes reached the ground quickly, piling deep in open drifts. Wind shaped it into ridges and hollows, exposing soil in some places and burying it in others. Young trees bent low under the weight, learning flexibility early or breaking if they could not. The forest watched itself endure. Cold nights tightened the ground. Roots held firm where they could, shifted where they must. Ice formed again along twigs and bark, but thinner this time, lighter, less patient. When branches flexed, the ice cracked and fell away instead of clinging. The forest had learned. Sounds carried farther through the divide now. On still nights, the soft settling of snow could be heard from one side to the other. A branch snapping in the open half echoed faintly into the darker woods, answered by nothing but silence. Animals moved differently, too. Paths shifted with the seasons. Some creatures preferred the shelter of the old forest, others the openness of the scar. Life sorted itself naturally, without judgment. When spring finally returned, it did not arrive evenly. Meltwater rushed through the divide first, carving shallow channels, feeding the soil, reshaping the ground once more. The shaded half thawed slowly, carefully, as it always had. 2 winters, 2 responses, 1 forest. The storm had not frozen the forest in time. It had taught it how to change, without breaking again. Change in a forest is rarely announced. It moves through small adjustments, through the angle of a branch, the depth of a root, the timing of a leaf's return. After the storm, after the split, the forest began to teach itself how to live within its new shape. Young trees learned first. Those growing near the divide developed wider stances, their roots spreading farther than those in the shaded half. They leaned with the wind instead of resisting it. Their trunks grew flexible before they grew tall, shaped by open air and shifting light. In the deeper forest, growth remained slow and deliberate. Saplings waited longer for their chance, stretching upward only when space allowed. Their strength came from patience, from learning to survive without sudden exposure. Both ways endured. As years layered over one another, the divide became less obvious to the eye, but clearer to the forest itself. Water flowed differently there. Snow melted faster. Seeds traveled farther. Storm spoke first to the open space before whispering into the darker woods beyond. The trees responded without thought. They thickened where needed. They thinned where light demanded it. They shed branches before they became burdens. The memory of ice lived quietly in their structure, not as fear, but as understanding. There were still storms. There were still winters heavy with snow. But when ice returned, it did not stay long. Branches flexed. Weight slid away. What once would have broken now merely tested. The forest did not become stronger in a single way. It became wiser. And deep beneath the soil, where roots crossed old scars and new paths alike, the land held everything together, not as it had been, but as it needed to be. The split remained. But it no longer felt like loss alone. It felt like knowledge passed forward, ring by ring, season by season, into a future that would never again be exactly the same, and never needed to be. There came a point when the divide no longer startled anyone. Animals crossed it without hesitation. Wind passed through it as if it had always been there. Snow settled into its shape naturally, no longer trying to hide it, no longer revealing it as something new. Silence returned, but not the fragile silence from before the storm. This silence was settled. In the mornings, frost formed along the edges of the opening first, tracing the boundary in pale lines. As the sun rose, those lines vanished slowly, leaving behind damp earth and darkened bark. The forest breathed in this rhythm, steady and untroubled. Sounds were softer now. Branches still creaked, but without strain. Ice still formed, but only thinly, briefly, letting go before weight could gather. The forest had learned how to release pressure before it became danger. Along the divide, fallen trunks had nearly disappeared into the ground. What once lay as obstacles now served as quiet foundations, nursing moss, sheltering insects, holding moisture through dry weeks. Life used what had been broken without ceremony. The two halves no longer felt like opposites. They felt like companions. Each offered something the other could not. Shelter, balanced exposure. Stillness, balanced motion. Memory, balanced change. Together they formed a forest that understood its own limits. At night, When the wind paused and the stars burned cold above the canopy, the forest rested deeply. No creaks of warning, no tension held too long, just the low, continuous presence of trees standing where they could, yielding where they must. The ice storm had once forced the forest to listen. Now the forest listened to itself. Forests do not tell their stories the way people do. There are no markers to point to, no signs to explain what happened here, no voices to pass the memory from one generation to the next, and yet the story remained written into the land itself, in the shape of the trees. Those near the divide still leaned slightly, even decades later, as if acknowledging a long-past force they had never personally felt. Their rings were uneven, wider on one side, narrower on the other, recording years of adjustment no eye could see without cutting them open. In the soil, beneath the surface, layers told a quiet history. Compressed snow turned to earth, broken wood turned to nutrients, roots grown around obstacles that no longer existed. The ground remembered the weight of ice and the sudden release that followed, in the light. Sun moved differently here. Morning arrived earlier along the divide, lingered longer, then faded slowly into shadow. Even on overcast days, the space felt brighter, more open, as if the sky had learned this place needed room. Visitors, if any passed through, might notice none of this consciously. They might feel only that the forest changed here, subtly, without explanation. A shift in air, a difference in sound, a sense that something once happened, long ago, that still mattered. But the forest did not need witnesses. It had already learned what it needed to know, that strength without flexibility breaks, that patience can carry weight, but only for so long. That loss does not end a system, it reshapes it. The ice storm was no longer an event, it was a lesson. And the forest lived it every day, without speaking a word. The wind arrived without warning, the way it often does when nothing seems ready for it. It was not a storm wind, no roar, no violence, just a steady current moving across the land, gathering speed as it crossed open ground, slipping easily into the forest where the divide had once been raw and new. Now it felt familiar. The wind entered the opening first, brushing across young trees that had grown accustomed to movement. They bent together, leaves trembling softly, their trunks flexible and sure. The sound they made was light, almost playful, nothing like the groaning cries of the old storm. As the wind continued, it slowed. The dense half of the forest received it gently, layers of branches breaking its strength, guiding it upward and away. What reached the deeper woods was only a whisper, barely enough to stir the canopy. The forest held. There was no tearing sound, no cracking ice, no sudden collapse. The wind passed through, carrying with it seeds, dust, and the faint memory of movement. It left without taking anything with it. In that moment, something subtle settled. The forest had proven itself, not through resistance, but through balance. The divide did not weaken it. It guided forces that once would have caused harm. Somewhere high in the canopy, a branch brushed another and then separated again, unharmed. Snow slid from a limb and vanished into the undergrowth without consequence. The wind moved on, and the forest remained, unchanged in shape, but certain in its endurance. There came a season when the forest stopped measuring itself against the past, not because the memory was gone, but because comparison was no longer necessary. The divide had existed long enough to feel permanent. Young trees grew up knowing nothing else. For them, the open corridor was not a scar, it was simply part of the world. They shaped themselves accordingly. Leaves angled toward light that arrived from the side. Roots reached outward, confident in soil, enriched by decades of decay. Growth followed patterns born after the storm, not before it. The forest was no longer becoming something new. It was something new. The shaded half continued its slow, deep rhythm. Moss thickened. Fallen leaves layered softly. Time pooled there, heavy and patient. The open half stayed brighter, more restless, shaped by wind and sun and seasonal change. Between them the divide rested, not empty, not broken, just open. In winter, it filled with snow that reflected the sky. In summer, it hummed quietly with insects and heat. In autumn, leaves gathered there from both sides, mixing colors that had once fallen separately. The forest no longer leaned inward or away. It stood differently, but together. If another storm were to come, it would not meet the same resistance it once had. Forces would be guided, shared, softened. Weight would be shed before it could gather too long in one place. The ice storm had changed the forest forever, but it had not weakened it. It had taught it how to continue. One winter, long after the storm had passed into quiet legend, snow returned the way it always promised to. It fell slowly, without ice hidden inside it, without weight meant to test strength. Flakes drifted down through open sky and tangled canopy alike, settling gently wherever they landed. Along the divide, the snow formed a smooth, even blanket. No sharp edges, no sudden collapse. Branches accepted the weight easily. Young trees bent and released it in small, patient motions. In the deeper forest, snow rested in layered stillness, caught and held by generations of growth. The forest exhaled. There was no sound but the softest settling, the hush of flakes touching flakes. Even the wind moved carefully, as if remembering something it did not wish to repeat. The divide disappeared for a while, hidden beneath white, but it was not erased. It rested there quietly, holding space beneath the snow, ready to reappear when warmth returned, not as damage, not as warning, just as structure. The forest did not fear winter anymore. It understood it. When the snow finally melted that year, it did so evenly. Water soaked into the ground without rushing. Streams swelled gently, then settled back into their familiar paths. Nothing tore loose. Nothing protested. The forest accepted the change the way it had learned to, by allowing movement instead of resisting it. Along the divide, new life stirred again. Not dramatic growth, not sudden transformation, just the quiet return of green. Moss thickened where fallen trunks had fully become earth. Ferns uncurled in places that once knew only shadow. Small flowers appeared briefly, then faded, leaving behind seeds for another time. The forest did not rush them. Each season arrived, did its work, and left. The trees that stood now were not the same as those that had fallen during the ice storm. They were shaped by a different understanding of balance. Their branches grew lighter, their crowns spread with space between them. They trusted the open air and respected the weight it could carry. Deep in the shaded half, the old rhythm continued, slow, steady, unchanged in its patience. Growth there remained quiet and deliberate, forming a counterpoint to the brighter, more responsive life along the divide. Together they endured. The ice storm became something the forest no longer needed to remember actively. Its lesson lived on in structure rather than memory, in shape rather than fear. Nothing had to recall the night of breaking for its effects to remain. The forest stood not because it was unbroken, but because it had learned how to remain standing after being changed. And in that endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, and complete, it found a peace deeper than stillness. There was a moment each year, brief, almost unnoticeable, when the forest seemed to pause. It happened in early autumn, when the air cooled but the cold had not yet settled in. Leaves shifted color slowly, without urgency. Light softened. Even the wind moved more gently, as if aware it was passing through something balanced and complete. The pause was most noticeable along the divide. Here, the forest felt suspended between what it had been and what it had become. The open space was no longer new, no longer changing rapidly, yet it never returned to stillness either. It existed in a quiet middle state, open enough to breathe, stable enough to endure. Leaves from both halves drifted into the corridor. Some were small and pale, dropped early from the shaded side. Others were broad and sun-warmed, falling later from trees shaped by open sky. They gathered together on the ground, layered without distinction, forming a soft, mixed covering. The forest did not separate its history. It held all of it. At night, mist sometimes formed along the divide, rising slowly from the ground and slipping between trunks. It blurred edges, softened distance, and made the forest feel endless again. In those moments it was hard to tell where one half ended and the other began. The divide remained, but quietly. Not as a boundary, not as a wound, but as a place where the forest had learned to pause, reflect, and continue without urgency. And when the moment passed, as it always did, the forest moved on, unchanged in shape, but steady in purpose. Eventually, even memory becomes part of the ground. Not forgotten, just settled. Like fallen leaves pressed into soil, like old paths softened by time, the story of the ice storm sank deep enough that it no longer surfaced unless something stirred it. The forest did not look back. It grew forward. Trees rose where space allowed them. Some grew tall and narrow, reaching quickly. Others grew wide and steady, content with their place. No single shape dominated. Diversity became strength, woven quietly into the landscape. Along the divide, the air always felt slightly different, not colder, not warmer, just open. A place where movement was allowed, where change passed through instead of stopping. Rain fell there first, sun reached there last, wind learned restraint there. Nothing announced this balance, it simply existed. If one listened closely, really closely, there was a faint rhythm to the forest now. Not a sound, but a pattern. Growth answering loss, light answering shadow, stillness answering motion. The storm had once forced these answers through pressure. Now they came naturally. The forest had not healed by returning to what it was. It had healed by becoming what it needed to be. And so it stood, split, shaped, and whole all at once, carrying forward a quiet truth written not in words, but in wood, soil, and time. There is no final moment in a forest, no single point where a story closes and remains finished. The ice storm that split the forest in half was not an ending, and what followed was not a conclusion. It was continuation, steady, patient, unremarkable in the way all lasting things are. The divide still exists. It always will, not as damage, not as memory alone, but as structure, an opening shaped by loss, maintained by balance, and filled with life that learned to move differently. Snow will fall there again. Wind will pass through again. Trees will lean, grow, and eventually return to the ground. The forest will not resist this. It never needed to. What endured was not the line of trees that once stood unbroken, but the ability of the forest to accept change without collapsing into it. Strength, the forest learned, was not measured by how much it could hold, but by how much it could release. And so the forest remains, split, but not divided, altered, but not diminished, changed, but never ended. The ice storm passed, the forest continued, and it will continue long after storms lose their names, long after memory fades into soil, long after silence becomes familiar again. Long after the ice storm stopped being remembered as an event, it still existed as a feeling. Not fear, not grief, but awareness. The forest moved through years the way it always had, quietly without marking them. Snow fell and melted, leaves returned and vanished. Branches grew heavy, then light again. Nothing unusual happened, and yet everything carried a subtle understanding shaped by what had once occurred. Along the divide, trees aged differently. Some that had grown quickly in open light slowed as space filled in around them. Their growth rings narrowed, adjusting, learning restraint. Others, once sheltered, now touched sunlight for the first time late in their lives, their crowns shifting slightly, cautiously, as if unsure whether the gift would last. It did. The divide had become dependable. It no longer widened. It no longer healed over. It stayed as it was, an open conversation between two ways of being. When storms arrived now, they passed through with less impact. Wind lost its sharpness crossing the opening. Snow distributed itself more evenly. Ice formed briefly, then released its hold before weight could gather. The forest did not brace. It adapted in motion. Nothing dramatic announced this success. No moment declared that balance had been achieved. The proof existed only in the absence of collapse, in the quiet continuity of standing trees. The storm that split the forest in half no longer mattered because of what it destroyed. It mattered because of what it changed forever. The way the forest understood itself, and that understanding, invisible but complete, lived on in every season that followed. There came a winter when the sky grew heavy again. Clouds gathered low and gray, pressing down on the forest with the familiar stillness that once had meant danger. The air sharpened. Snow began as flakes, then softened into cold rain that hinted at ice. Long ago, this would have been the moment the forest tightened. This time it did not. Branches carried the first glaze without tension. They shed what they could, allowing small sheets of ice to slip free before weight could settle too deeply. Trees stood with space between their limbs now, no longer locking together in ways that trapped burden. Along the divide, water ran off easily, guided by slopes shaped through years of quiet change. Ice formed briefly, then cracked and fell away in soft fragments that disappeared into the snow. The forest listened, but without fear. No long groans echoed through the trunks. No deep tearing sounds traveled through root and soil. The night passed with only the ordinary sounds of winter settling into place. By morning, the ice was already loosening. Sunlight found its way into the open space, warming bark and branch just enough to encourage release. The forest moved gently, flexing, adjusting, letting go. The storm ended without consequence. Not because the forest had grown harder, but because it had grown lighter. What once would have tested every fiber now passed through without harm. Weight was no longer something to endure at all costs. It was something to manage, to distribute, to release. The forest had learned the difference, and in that understanding it stood calmly beneath the sky, ready for whatever might come next. Change does not belong only to what stands above the snow. Beneath the forest, the ground had been learning too. Long after the ice storm, long after trunks had fallen and risen again in new forms, the soil carried its own memory, not as pain, not as weakness, but as shape. Channels formed where water had once rushed during the thaw. Compacted layers loosened where roots had torn free and grown again in different directions. The earth adjusted quietly. Along the divide, the ground became softer and deeper, richer with what had fallen and returned. Layers of broken wood, leaves, and time pressed together into something resilient. Water no longer pooled dangerously there. It soaked in, moved outward, fed both sides evenly. Roots learned new paths, too. Instead of crossing tightly and depending on one another for strength, they spread wider, reaching sideways as much as downward. They shared space rather than competing for it, weaving a network that could shift without tearing. When rain came hard, the soil held. When drought followed, it released what it could. When frost returned, it expanded and rested without cracking apart. The forest above trusted this unseen work. Trees grew knowing the ground would move with them, not against them. The divide no longer threatened collapse during storms or thaw. It had become a place of balance, a low, quiet anchor holding change without resisting it. Nothing announced this transformation, but every year that passed without disaster confirmed it. The ice storm had split wood and sky. Time had taught the ground how to hold what remained. There was a subtle shift that happened without a season to mark it. The forest stopped waiting. It no longer waited for the next storm to test it, nor for time to soften its edges further. Growth no longer felt cautious. Loss no longer felt like something that needed explanation. Everything simply took its place in the long, steady movement forward. Along the divide, trees grew without hesitation now. Their branches reached into open air with confidence, no longer measuring how much space they were allowed. Leaves unfolded fully each spring, trusting the light that had proven reliable year after year. In the shaded half, the forest deepened rather than expanded. Layers thickened. Shadows grew richer. Life there did not rush toward the divide. It remained content in stillness, knowing its role had not diminished. The two halves no longer leaned toward one another for balance. They carried their own. Wind passed through and left without consequence. Rain arrived and soaked in evenly. Snow settled and melted without urgency. Even time itself seemed to move more smoothly, no longer interrupted by sudden correction. The forest had reached a quiet maturity, not old age, something calmer, a state where change was no longer a threat, and stability was no longer rigid. Everything held together because it was allowed to move. If the ice storm had returned now, it would not have found the same forest. It would have found one that understood release, one that knew when to bend, when to open, and when to let weight fall away before it became destruction. The forest was no longer defined by what split it. It was defined by what it had become after. Decades passed, though the forest never counted them. Trees grew tall enough to cast long, familiar shadows across the divide. Others fell quietly, one at a time without drama, their places already claimed by waiting saplings. Nothing happened suddenly anymore. The shape held. The divide remained wide enough to let light through, narrow enough to feel connected. It no longer expanded or softened further. It had settled into a form that fit the land, the wind, and the seasons. Birds crossed it without thinking. Animals rested within it. Plants grew, knowing it would stay. The forest did not need to remember the storm to understand the space it had created. The shape itself carried the lesson. Every branch that grew lighter, every root that spread wider, every canopy that left room for movement reinforced what had been learned. The forest no longer resisted weight. It distributed it. Snow fell and slid away. Ice formed and broke free. Rain soaked in and flowed outward. Pressure never gathered long enough to become danger again. The shape that lasted was not one of strength alone. It was one of balance. And balance, once found, required no effort to maintain. There came a time when even the idea of change softened, not because change had stopped, but because it no longer demanded attention. The forest moved through its days with an ease that felt earned, not accidental, nothing strained, nothing held more than it could carry. Morning light slid across the divide and into the deeper woods without resistance. It touched bark, warmed leaves, then moved on. Shadows followed naturally, unhurried, knowing they would return again tomorrow. The forest rested, not asleep, but settled. Roots no longer searched urgently for new ground. They extended steadily, confidently, trusting the soil shaped by years of quiet adjustment. Branches grew with intention, leaving space between one another, allowing air to pass freely, allowing snow to fall and leave again without consequence. Even decay felt gentle. What fell returned easily to the ground. What returned nourished what stood. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. The cycle moved with a calm certainty that required no correction. The divide had become a place of rest, not emptiness, not absence, but balance made visible. Here, the forest no longer remembered the storm as disruption. It remembered it as transition, a moment that allowed everything after to exist as it now did. And so the forest stood quietly with itself, complete not because it was untouched, but because it had learned how to remain whole after being changed. There are moments when a place no longer needs to be taught. The forest reached one of those moments quietly, without ceremony or signal. Nothing changed all at once. No season announced it. No storm tested it. The understanding simply settled in, complete. The trees grew without question now. They did not reach too far. They did not crowd one another. They did not cling to weight. They could not hold. Growth followed space. Space followed light. Light followed time. Everything moved in agreement. Along the divide, the air always felt open, but never empty. It carried warmth in summer, coolness in winter, and motion in every season. It was a place where forces passed through instead of pressing down. The shaded forest remained deep and slow, unchanged in its nature. The open half remained flexible and responsive. Neither tried to become the other. Together, they formed something complete. The storm had once forced the forest to learn. Now, the forest simply knew. It knew when to yield. It knew when to stand. It knew when to let go. Nothing more was required. And so the forest continued, not waiting, not remembering, not bracing, just living in the shape it had earned, season after season without effort or fear. Time, which had once pressed so heavily on the forest, now moved like a companion, not something to endure, not something to resist, just something that passed through, the way wind did, the way light did, the way rain always had. Years slipped by without leaving sharp marks. Growth happened where it was welcome. Decline happened where it was natural. Nothing felt interrupted. Nothing felt unfinished. Along the divide, the forest seemed to breathe more deeply. In summer, warmth settled there and lingered, encouraging slow, steady life. In autumn, Leaves gathered gently, not in piles, but in thin, thoughtful layers. In winter, snow filled the space evenly, respecting its shape, leaving again without argument. The forest no longer tightened when the sky darkened. Clouds could gather low and heavy, and the trees would simply wait, flexible and calm. Rain would fall, soak in, move on. Ice might form briefly, then release. Wait never stayed long enough to become a threat. The agreement was unspoken, but absolute. The forest would continue to change. Time would continue to pass. Neither would try to dominate the other. And in that understanding, the forest found something rare, not permanence, but peace. There was a gentleness to the way the forest carried itself now. Not weakness, gentleness earned through understanding. The trees no longer held the land tightly, no longer pressed themselves into place as if afraid of being moved. They rested in it, connected but unstrained. Along the divide, the ground stayed open enough to receive what came and firm enough to support what grew. When rain arrived, it was welcomed. When snow fell, it settled and left. When wind passed through, it was guided rather than resisted. Nothing was forced. The forest had learned that holding too tightly was a kind of breaking. That endurance did not come from refusal, but from allowance, from letting pressure move on before it became damage. Even silence felt different here. It was not the silence of waiting or fear, but the silence of things aligned. A silence that did not ask questions. A silence that trusted tomorrow to arrive as it always had. The divide stood as proof, not of loss, but of wisdom. A place shaped by what had fallen and what had risen after. A reminder that balance is not stillness, but motion that knows when to slow. And so the forest held without holding. It stood without strain. It continued without effort. There were days when the sky felt closer to the forest than anywhere else. Clouds moved slowly overhead, their reflections drifting across leaves and open space alike. Light changed gently, without sharp edges. Even storms passed with a kind of courtesy, as if aware they were moving through something that understood them. Along the divide, the sky felt present, not pressing down, not distant, just there, sharing space. Rain fell in clean lines, reaching the ground without being caught or broken apart. Sun followed, warming soil and bark in equal measure. Wind traced familiar paths, never surprised by the openness it found. The forest responded without effort. Branches lifted and settled. Leaves turned and returned. Roots held steady, not rigid, not loose. Everything moved as if in quiet agreement with the forces passing through. Nothing was being tested anymore, not because challenges had ended, but because the forest no longer met them with resistance. What arrived was allowed to pass. What remained was absorbed. What needed to leave was released. The divide no longer stood out. It blended into the rhythm of the place, neither hidden nor emphasized. Just a part of how the forest breathed, how it balanced light and shadow, movement and rest. The ice storm had once split the forest in half. Now even the sky seemed to recognize what the forest had become and treated it accordingly. There are times when strength no longer needs to be demonstrated. The forest reached that time quietly. No storm announced it, no season confirmed it. The certainty lived in the absence of struggle, in the way branches no longer trembled before weather arrived, in the way roots rested confidently in soil shaped by years of gentle movement. Along the divide, nothing waited for validation. Light came and went. Wind passed through. Rain fell. then left. Each force met a forest that did not challenge it, did not brace against it, did not test itself for the sake of testing. The forest existed comfortably within its limits, knowing them well enough not to cross them. What once might have felt like exposure now felt like openness. What once might have felt like vulnerability now felt like flexibility. Trees grew into the space that welcomed them and stopped where it did not. Leaves unfolded fully, then let go without regret. Fallen wood returned to the ground without resistance, becoming part of what would rise next. The divide was no longer a reminder. It was simply a feature, like a stream, like a ridge, like a clearing shaped by time rather than intention, something the forest accepted without question. The ice storm had asked everything of the forest once. Now nothing asked that much again, and the forest did not need it to. If someone had tried to explain the forest now, words would have failed them. There was no single thing to point to, no fallen giant, no fresh growth, no dramatic contrast. What existed was balance, and balance rarely announces itself. It hides in the way nothing seems wrong. Along the divide, the ground felt steady underfoot, not hard, not soft, just certain. The trees nearby stood at different heights and distances, never crowding, never isolating themselves. Space existed where it was needed, and absence no longer felt like loss. The forest had learned proportion. Branches grew lighter toward their ends. Crowns opened instead of thickening endlessly. Leaves arranged themselves to share light rather than compete for it. Every small decision, made without thought, added up to a system that carried weight without strain. Even decay followed this balance. What died did not linger too long. What returned fed exactly what was waiting. Nothing piled up, nothing starved. The forest moved in small, constant exchanges that kept everything aligned. The divide was part of this now. It allowed movement without disruption. It guided wind without accelerating it. It offered light without drying the soil beneath. It was openness with restraint, a rare and careful thing. The ice storm had forced a lesson once, harshly. Now the lesson lived quietly everywhere. And because it lived everywhere, it was no longer visible at all. There is a moment in long-living places when time seems to loosen its grip, not because it stops, but because it no longer leaves sharp edges behind. The forest entered that moment gradually, without noticing when it began. Days passed, seasons turned, years folded into one another so smoothly that none stood out alone. Along the divide, the feeling was strongest. The space no longer felt young or old. It did not suggest beginnings or endings. It simply existed, steady and complete, as if it had always been part of the land's design. Trees that grew there carried no urgency. Trees that aged there did so without resistance. Nothing hurried, nothing lingered too long. The forest moved at a pace that belonged only to itself. Morning light arrived without promise. Evening darkness settled without warning. Rain cooled the ground. Heat lifted gently. Everything came and went without leaving imbalance behind. Even memory softened. The ice storm no longer felt like something that had happened long ago. It felt like something that had happened to become now, a shaping force rather than a point in time. The forest no longer marked the divide as a place of change. It marked it as a place of continuity, where everything passed through and nothing was forced to stay. Names fell away before anything else did. The forest did not call the divide a scar anymore. It did not remember the storm as ice or rain or weight. Those words belong to a time when things needed explanation. Now everything simply was. The open place where trees once fell had no title. It was not center or edge. It was not before or after. It was a shape the land accepted, the way it accepted slopes and hollows, streams and ridges. The forest stopped separating itself into halves. Shade and light no longer felt opposed. They moved together, trading places through the day. What rested in shadow at dawn warmed in sun by afternoon. What stood open at noon cooled by evening. Nothing stayed fixed. Even the trees nearest the divide changed identities over time. What once grew in open air slowly found neighbors. What once stood crowded found space again as others returned to the ground. The forest rearranged itself without concern for consistency. Loss no longer felt like disappearance. It felt like movement. A tree fell and light shifted. Light shifted and growth followed. Growth matured and space tightened. Space tightened and something released again. The cycle turned endlessly without drama. The forest no longer needed to remember why it had changed. It only needed to continue changing. And so it did, quietly, confidently, without naming the forces that shaped it. What remained was not a place. It was a way of being. The forest no longer held itself against the future or the past. It moved through the present with a calm that came from understanding its own limits. Nothing demanded permanence. Nothing feared change. Along the divide, though it was no longer thought of as such, the air always felt gently alive, not busy, not empty, simply active in small, continuous ways. Insects traced invisible paths. Seeds traveled short distances and found rest. Light shifted slowly, painting the ground with patterns that never repeated exactly. The forest trusted this movement. Trees no longer grew to dominate space. They grew to belong within it. Branches curved where wind suggested. Roots stopped where soil asked them to. Every form felt negotiated rather than imposed. Storms still came. They always would. But now they arrived as visitors, not invaders. They passed through, left small changes behind, and moved on without taking more than the forest was willing to give. Nothing stood untouched. Nothing stood afraid. The ice storm that once split the forest in half had faded into the deepest layers of the land, no longer remembered as cold or breakage or loss. It existed only as wisdom carried forward, quiet, invisible, complete. The forest did not need to speak of it. The forest was the story. Calm is not the absence of force. It is the presence of understanding. The forest had reached a calm that did not depend on perfect weather or gentle seasons. It was a calm that existed even when clouds gathered low, even when winds shifted suddenly, even when cold returned earlier than expected. Along the open place where the forest once broke, everything responded without tension. Branches moved first, not last. Leaves turned their faces away from pressure. Roots held firm without locking themselves in place. Nothing waited to be tested anymore. The forest had learned that endurance was not about standing still. It was about moving at the right moment, in the right amount, for the right reason. Every part of it acted with quiet agreement, not command. When rain fell hard, the ground accepted it and passed it on. When snow fell deep, branches shared the weight and released it. When wind pushed, trunks bent and returned without memory of strain. The calm held. Not fragile, not temporary, but resilient in a way that did not need to announce itself. The forest no longer prepared for storms. It simply lived in a shape that storms could pass through. Endurance, the forest had learned, was not endless holding. It was knowing when to remain and when to release. Along the place that had once been split open by ice, this knowledge lived quietly in every form. Trees no longer tried to outlast time. They grew with it. When their work was done, they returned to the ground without resistance, making room for what followed. Nothing struggled to stay longer than it should. A trunk weakened by age leaned slowly, predictably, guided by wind and gravity rather than surprised by them. When it fell, it did not tear at its neighbors. It rested gently, already becoming shelter, already becoming soil. The forest accepted this without pause. Growth rose nearby, not hurried, not delayed. Saplings reached upward through gaps that felt natural, not forced. Light adjusted, shade followed. Balance restored itself without effort. The endurance that mattered was not in how long something stood. It was in how smoothly change passed through the whole. The ice storm had once demanded endurance through strain. Now endurance meant continuity without damage. And the forest carried that understanding forward, quietly, patiently, ready to remain, ready to let go, exactly when each was required. Silence returned to the forest in its purest form. Not the silence of anticipation, not the silence of aftermath, but the silence of things existing exactly as they should. Along the open place where the forest once broke apart, sound no longer carried uneasily. It settled. Footsteps of animals faded naturally. The wind whispered, then moved on. Even rain seemed to land more softly, as if it understood the ground would receive it without protest. Nothing waited to happen. The forest did not listen for warning anymore. It listened only to itself, to the subtle signals that guided growth, release, rest. A branch dried and fell when it was ready. A seed sprouted when conditions allowed. Shade deepened, light shifted, and neither demanded explanation. The silence held all of this. It held movement without noise, change without disruption, time without urgency. What had once been a divide was now simply a place where silence felt complete, wide enough to breathe, narrow enough to belong. The forest did not fill it. It did not erase it. It honored it. And in that quiet acceptance, the forest continued, unafraid of what might come, unburdened by what had passed. There was a time when the forest had relied on density for safety, when standing close meant survival, when overlapping branches and tangled roots were the only defense against cold, wind, and weight. That time had passed. Now, the forest itself was the shelter, not because it blocked every force, but because it understood how to guide them. Protection came not from thickness, but from design shaped slowly through experience. Along the open place, the forest no longer closed ranks when weather approached. It opened gently, allowing wind to pass without gathering speed, allowing snow to fall without piling too deeply, allowing rain to soak in without rushing away. Shelter had become movement. In the deeper woods, stillness remained. But it was a chosen stillness, not a necessary one. The forest there held warmth and moisture carefully, releasing both only when the wider system asked for it. Together, the two ways of being worked as one. Nothing needed reinforcement. Nothing needed repair. The forest had arranged itself into a form that could hold life comfortably without effort, without fear. It had become a place where endurance did not require sacrifice, only awareness. The ice storm had once taken shelter away. What followed had created something stronger. The forest had become its own protection. If there was an ending, it did not arrive all at once. It moved the way the forest moved, slowly, quietly, without announcement. The trees did not gather for it. The wind did not pause. The ground did not mark the moment. Life continued exactly as it had learned to. Along the open place, light rose and fell in familiar patterns. In the deeper forest, shadows remained cool and patient. Between them, the balance held. Not fixed, not fragile, but alive. The ice storm had once been a moment of force. What followed became a way. The forest no longer measured itself by what it had lost or gained. It existed in a constant state of becoming, always shaped, always shaping, never finished. Even this sense of completion did not settle for long. It shifted, adjusted, breathed. Nothing stood forever. Nothing vanished completely. Everything belonged to the movement between. And so the forest remained, not as a monument to survival, not as a reminder of destruction, but as proof that even the deepest splits can become places of connection when time is allowed to work without resistance. The story did not end. It simply continued, one quiet season at a time. There came a time when no one noticed the forest at all. No footsteps crossed it with intention. No eyes measured its shape or searched for meaning. No voice tried to turn what it was into a lesson. And that was when it was most complete. The forest did not need to be observed to exist properly. It did not need to be remembered, studied, or named. It grew because growing was what it did. It released because releasing was necessary. Balance continued without witness. Along the open place, trees rose and fell at their own pace. Some stood for decades, some for centuries. Some never grew tall at all, content to spread low and wide, shaping the ground in quieter ways. Light continued to pass through, never blocked, never wasted. The deeper forest remained slow and cool, a place where time felt thicker, where change moved in long arcs instead of quick turns. Together, the two spaces held each other without effort. Nothing waited for another ice storm. If one came, it would come. If it did not, that was fine too. The forest had moved beyond reaction. It existed in readiness, not tense, not guarded, just prepared by understanding rather than fear. The ice storm that once split the forest in half had become indistinguishable from the countless forces that had shaped the land before it and would shape it again. It was no longer special. It was simply part of the making. And in that quiet anonymity, long after anyone was watching, the forest continued to be exactly what it needed to be. Over time, the forest stopped feeling like something that had been made. It felt like something that had been chosen. The land beneath it settled into its own preferences, gentle rises where water liked to pause, shallow channels where it preferred to leave. The open place followed these inclinations naturally, curving where the ground curved, narrowing where soil tightened, widening where roots asked for room. Nothing was forced into symmetry. The forest listened to the land now more than it listened to the sky. Trees grew where the earth welcomed them. Where the soil resisted, grasses and low plants took over instead, holding the ground in quieter ways. Fallen trunks became part of the terrain, shaping paths for water, shade for seedlings, shelter for small lives that needed no attention. The divide no longer felt like a line. It felt like a decision the land had made and the forest had agreed to. Seasons continued, but they passed lightly. Winter brushed the branches and moved on. Summer warmed the ground and left it richer. Autumn layered color gently. Spring arrived without urgency, The forest did not argue with any of it. The ice storm had once imposed change. What followed became cooperation. And in that cooperation, the forest and the land moved forward together, no longer correcting one another, no longer testing limits, just shaping and reshaping in quiet agreement. There was no moment when the forest locked into place. Instead, it reached a state where nothing needed to be adjusted urgently. Every part fit well enough that change could arrive without demanding correction. The land did not strain beneath the trees. The trees did not push beyond what the land offered. Along the open place, growth slowed, not from lack, but from completion. Space was used without being filled. Light passed through without being claimed. The ground held exactly what it needed and no more. The forest no longer felt arranged. It felt resolved. Not finished, never finished, but settled into a form that welcomed whatever came next. A fallen branch no longer felt like loss. A new shoot no longer felt like hope. Both were simply parts of a continuous motion that required no emotion to sustain it. Even the divide seemed to soften into meaning rather than shape. It was not wide or narrow, not open or closed, just present, doing its work quietly. The ice storm had once broken the forest open. What followed had allowed everything to find where it belonged. And in that belonging, the forest reached a rare balance, one that did not need protection, explanation, or memory to remain whole. In the end, if it could ever be called an end, the forest did not stand in triumph. It stood in stillness, not frozen, not unmoving, but calm in the deepest sense of the word. The place where the ice storm had once split the forest in half no longer announced itself. It did not demand attention. It simply existed as part of the land's quiet logic, the way a river bend exists, or a clearing shaped by light rather than intention. Trees rose and fell without urgency. Roots held and released without struggle. Light and shadow traded places without argument. Nothing tried to return to what had been lost. Nothing tried to protect what could not last. The forest had learned that wholeness was not sameness. It was relationship, between openness and shelter, between weight and release, between memory and letting go. The ice storm had passed long ago. Its cold had melted into soil. Its breakage had softened into form. What remained was not damage, but understanding, quiet, complete, and alive in every season. And so the forest continued, not waiting, not remembering, just being, in the shape it had earned, under a sky that moved freely above it, on land that held it without holding too tightly. The forest was still, and it would remain so for as long as forests remain.